Hey, I'm Ryan with Trilix. This is
Michael with Trilix. Hi guys.
Yeah. Hey, we're here talking about
To look at the famous blockchain the impossibility trilemma, right? As stated by
Oh
Vitalik.
yeah, that's what it was. The blockchain
Yeah.
trilemma. Okay, good. All right. Yeah. So yeah, as a tech person, first and foremost, I gotta say, when it comes to the blockchain trilemma, we talk about it a fair amount. But I personally think that it's not true. In other words, that there, not necessarily not that it's not true. It's that it's a theory that hasn't been proven or disproven. Right? It was sort of put out there by Vitalik,
Yeah,
and
but for the record, the theory is that there is this trilemma of scalability, security, and decentralization, and it's impossible to get 3 out of 3. Like that, usually you get 1 of 3, and if you're really, really good, then you're gonna have a platform that gives you 2 out of 3, right? That's the idea.
right. And for me, what I would say is aiming for 100% of anything is one, not that's not actually possible because you don't know what you don't know. So the end point of the triangle is always an unknown. So you can't, it's something you can approach. But second of all, there's an awful lot of distance in the middle of that stupid triangle, right? You can, you can aim all over the place now, and you can certainly get dead center, which is probably not optimal, right? Yeah, but you can definitely get aspects of all three of these things, and that's one thing that really bothers me is that it's accepted as a rule that you can get one or two of the three, but not all three. When in fact it's that well, there's this assumption that they actually are warring with one another, that scalability and decentralization somehow combat each other. That may or may not be true. But that people are designing with this in mind puts arbitrary limits on what they're trying to do. That's what bugs me about it, right? It's like why should we accept this as truth until there's some computer science backing it? And I haven't seen any. Have you?
No.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
I'm not a computer science guy. But no.
yeah, but right. So yeah, I guess from a technical perspective, it's I like the idea that they're talking about the topics. That's a good thing. But accepting that you can't have your cake and eat it too, with regard to these three topics, that I think bears some additional scrutiny, and I think that's what we're here to look into a little bit, right? Especially as you said, as it pertains to things like bridges, especially between alternate platforms, and how those are designed and managed today.
Maybe let's expand on that, right? Because Trilix was born from the understanding that a lot of problems in the blockchain space, like the trilemma problem, are, let's say, bad problems to solve, or maybe badly formulated problems, right? I mean, people are asking questions that doesn't, let's say, answering them doesn't get you anywhere, right? And you guys, well, when you, let's say, started designing Trilix and the architecture behind it, and the whole concept, you look at blockchain from a completely different, say, non-orthodox point of view, right? Especially in the Web3 space. So maybe if you can expand on this a little bit.
Orthodox Web3 space. I'm gonna skip that for what I like the term, but I'm trying to figure out how it gets. Yeah, okay. So what we do is I guess it comes down to a bit like philosophy. We don't assume that any technology exists in a vacuum and that it wasn't born in a vacuum. And so we came to the Web3 space completely outside the crypto world. Like for us, it wasn't. We started thinking about it based on journaling and ledgering and databases, right? We had problems where we had distributed databases, They were taking action on multiple things at the same time, in atomic transactions coming in all over the place. But we had to have a certain sense of order at a global level. And so we looked at different technologies at the time. This is probably mid 2000s, to say, okay, if we've broken Humpty Dumpty up in all these pieces, but you got to figure out which piece broke when, at least to some extent, to combat things like fraud and risk and whatnot. How are you going to do that? The answer is, well, you've got to have a single sense of time. And the ways to do that at the time were either to use transaction logs inside databases or to come up with some external source. Both have their merits and whatnot. I'm not going to go into today, but anyway, so we had a lot of experience with this idea that that journals can help you be able to reconstruct time, but we also know that they have a lot of problems, and cause their own issues. And so in thinking through that over time, especially as we were building much larger systems, we kept coming back to this. And so we came to the Web3 world by looking at blockchain, especially as the latest step in the journal discussion, right? And it happened to be being used at the time for crypto. And to be honest, I wish that I had paid more attention to the crypto side, because I'd probably be worth a lot more right now than I am. But I kind of considered that to be a very easy use case for it. But it wasn't the use case I was particularly interested in. I was looking at things like DLT as to figure out how I could make use of it. So yeah, we came at it from this different pedigree. And part of that pedigree says, look, we stand on the shoulders of everybody that came before us. And so to me, the digital ledger and journal was just a new step in a progression that had started, decades before, to be able to coordinate transactions in a safe way, but in a way that was more generic and outside the sort of bounds of a particular database or data structure. And so that's where we got interested in it. And of course so we did that, and we also immediately saw that there were some problems with that. Anytime you do one thing at a time, it's great for not being detected. I mean, all the way back in 1977, you heard, the Banthas, the Tuscan Raiders go in single file to hide their numbers, right? Doing thing one at a time has been around for a long, long time, right? But we also know that when they do that, you hide your numbers, but you also take a lot longer to cross the desert when you do that way. And it's the same thing with any type of one thing at a time. So we saw that as a problem, and we started thinking, what can we do that can help alleviate that. And so that's where we came to looking at graph and things like that, which we probably won't talk a whole lot about today.
Yeah, but just maybe for the rest of humanity, well, when you talk about one thing at a time for a blockchain, it basically means that there's just one chain that is considered the official chain, right? And
right.
for Bitcoin, it's the longest one, right? And you have only a finite space in every block. So
right, yeah,
this is
one chain and one block. You're fighting over what transactions get into the next block and the next block and the next block. And then to add to that a little bit, and that history is written by the winners, right? So whatever the longest chain is, or the most agreed upon chain, or the most valuable chain, however you feel like ordering what is considered your source of truth, the winner is the one that's writing that. So you don't have any window into what was attempted to happen after you seal the block, right? Which is good from a recording what happened standpoint, but it's not good for recording what was trying to happen or where you could have
another old movie reference, like the Minority Report, right?
Yes, right, yeah. If that's weird, because that actually is one of my favorite movies too. It's a terrible movie, but I still love it. But yeah, you don't know what was trying to be happening. And skipping ahead to get us back on topic a little bit more, because I'm sure we'll spend a lot more time talking through the other stuff about Trilix, is when it comes to things like bridging, right? You are trying, the attempt is being made to walk some type of value from one place to another. And presumably you're starting on a place that you at least know well. Like you're starting on your side of the bridge, so you're at least familiar with the road leading up to the bridge, kind of, so to speak, right? And then you're going to another place where the other side of the bridge is different. So you know, picture the bridge dividing two states or two countries or something like that. And so, you know, what's interesting about that is you're still trying to do this one thing at a time. You want to make sure that every step you take is understood, but at some point you switch into another world. And while you may be familiar with your own feet and the value you're carrying, right, the rest of the world around you is now you're a stranger, right, at some point in this process. And that gets to be problematic when you're trying to code this behavior, and it's also going to make our metaphor break down for actually walking at some point.
And I don't know, but maybe would the practical example be if I'm bridging assets, let's say from Ethereum to, let's say, Solana, just for the sake of argument, right? Then what you're saying is that the Ethereum validators are familiar with the Ethereum environment, with the Ethereum blockchain, what's happening over there and the rules, right? But once this value is set to be transferred, for example, to Solana at this point, right? They have no way of knowing what's happening on this other side of the bridge, right? So they have no notion of whether this transfer has been completed or not, what's happening on Solana.
Yeah, and it's one step worse than that. It's they're not familiar with the entity type that you're doing things with. So like on Ethereum, it's, yeah, you're familiar with the mechanism you go by, how you validate it and things like that, but it's also the car you're driving, the types of stuff that fit in your car, the type of engine that's in it, you know, which when we wrap it up would be the contract, right, is something that's designed, enforced, and understood on Ethereum. The token type, in the case of exchanging value, right, is something that is defined by the contract and defined by the standards on Ethereum. When you jump to something different, even if it's still in EVM compatible, but you know, we'll go with Solana here, like you're jumping not just to an unfamiliar, you know, roadway or unfamiliar means of validation. You're jumping to a completely foreign entity type, right? There's no 721 or 720 token on Solana. There's a thing that functions like a token, but they're not the same. They don't have the same rules. They don't have the same embodiments. They don't have the same, you know, characteristics and stuff. And so you're trying to map this, you know, this entity that was born and lived over here into, you know, the same thing over there when there's actually no sameness.
Yeah, and even the definition of the truth is different, right? Because on
Right.
Ethereum, you have the longest chain. On Solana, you have this sort of time vector idea
Right.
that
This
sometimes
historical,
works.
yeah, this historical record thing. Yeah, and I don't think that we spend enough time, one, thinking through what that actually means. And I think that's part of what we're here to talk about, to some extent, is what's actually happening when you go through that. Because it's one thing to be able to just do a mapping exercise. You know, we talk about that a lot in data management. You know, you're going to take object one and turn it into object two. They've got some things in common. There's some things that are not. And so you go through this exercise of going, okay, name. Well, that makes sense. There's a name over here, but then there's, you know, last field plowed by. Over here, I've got a parking lot. I'll map those together. You see what I'm saying? Like you go through this exercise where you tie the different fields together and whatnot, and then you create a schema that says, okay, here's what we've mapped. The trouble is you don't have any kind of record there. You also don't have a common set of schemas, and there's no way to keep them even if you did, right? Who's going to be in charge of what the mapping is? Is it going to be Ethereum? Is it going to be Solana? Is there going to be a copy on both? And if so, how do you find the copy? If everybody's allowed to do this on their own, which they are, right, then I can have my own version. Someone else can have a different version. They're both available. So how do you know which is right? What happens if I try and take my version that I started with on Ethereum and I end up mapping to your version on Solana? You see what I'm saying? And there's nothing to even point out that happened, much less govern it, control it, point out that something's not right. And these are all missing. And yet we plow valiantly forward in moving value across these chains, without any way to demonstrate that what we did was correct.
Mhm.
You know, from a data perspective, that is not just dangerous, it's negligent, right?
Mhm.
Even if you're doing the right thing, right? And in fact, sometimes it's especially when you're doing the right thing, because if it works for most cases and it works well for most cases, it gets to be even harder and more impactful when it doesn't work, right? When someone acts badly and you're expecting them not to, or when something goes wrong and you have no way to redress it, right?
Correct.
And that's the kind of stuff that we're up against, I think, right now,
Yeah.
with most of the bridges that are available.
Yeah, so I mean, this is the tech take on bridges, right? And from the, let's say, end user, or let's say value management point of view, the way I see it, which is, well, there are, let's say, several problems that maybe are just a byproduct of bad technology or bad architecture, but you know, I read the statistics that last year there were somewhere close to $3 billion worth of tokens lost in bridge hacks, right? So it's not nearly as much as in the FTX scam, but still it's a lot of money, right? And why is this happening, right? So one thing is that this whole transaction of bridging happens up in the air somehow, right? So you have some sort of a smart contract on one chain, you have some sort of a smart contract on the other chain, and there is some sort of a governance body that decides how to switch the state of those two smart contracts. Right? But
Right.
there's no record of it, and you don't really know what, let's say, what's happening in between. And what's even more concerning, from my point of view, is that when you talk about this body that governs it, and people say it's decentralized, there is some sort of a consensus mechanism. And when you have a consensus mechanism, those decentralized entities can decide what is true, what is not true, which is a weird notion, because let's say if I bridge my tokens, I wouldn't like to give away the notion that those tokens belong to me to some sort of voting mechanism, right?
Right.
Because if the majority decides that pollution is profitable for them, then I mean, what's the incentive
Right.
to not to open up the contract and pay ourselves a nice Christmas bonus? Right?
When I worked for eBay, uh, one year early on, Meg gave everybody a book at Christmas time. It was like part of, like, you know, the all hands, here's your little Christmas present. I mean, not your bonus, but like this book that everybody gave. And in the back, the last page of the book said, "Thank you for helping us enable the world economic, or the world, yeah, the world economic democracy."
Mm.
And I was like, wait, we're all going to vote on how much the dollar's worth? That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, right? Like, that's just crazy, right? But nobody questioned it.
Mm.
Fast forward 15 years, and that's literally what you just explained, right? That you've
Yeah.
got this community that's essentially voting on what's truthful, what's valuable, what's not. Um, and it seems cool in some cases, but when it's your case, is it all that cool? You know, like
Yeah,
when it's
exactly.
you marching across the bridge, do you really want whoever you don't know on the other side to determine the second that you step over there that you're worth half what you thought you were?
Yeah, exactly. Right. And not to mention that, let's say, even if we have all the actors, let's say, behaving well because I don't know, because they have high moral standards or whatever, and they operate the bridge as they should, you still have the risk of, at some point, this sort of activity is not going to be viable for them for whatever reason, and they decide not to operate it.
Right.
And what happens then, right? This is my favorite question. What happens if there are no longer validators interested invalidating all of this. So what? Then we're going to get to a situation where there's just one entity that is the last validator standing, gets to pick what's happening in those tokens locked inside those contracts. I mean, this is. This sounds very risky from a business point of view.
It's dangerous. And there ought to be a better way, or at least a way that can safeguard some of these problems in the middle. As you're walking across the bridge, like, wouldn't it be nice if there was somebody that at least could hold a record that said you came from there and you went over here, right? Like, there's no record of that. And I don't think people even understand that basic thing, that there's no, from the perspective of the bridge you just walked, the other end of the bridge you just walked onto, you didn't come into existence until you took the first step onto that side. That's the beginning of your history.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as the perspective of the other side, the place you left, you're just gone.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you don't exist anymore. There's nothing that says, actually, this person tried to walk across a bridge. So, one thing that you talk about the money that was lost in bridge hacks, that's documented stolen money. We have no idea how much money and how much value was lost because somebody's computer crashed in the middle of trying to do a bridge transaction, right? Or you didn't make it into the block and there was no way to roll it back because you're already locked on one side, right? There's literally no way to know, right? I'm hoping the answer is nobody. But I've been in this business for a really long time, and I can tell you, if it's possible to happen, it will happen, right? And sometimes it happens a lot more often than you think, right? And we should at least be able to account for that. If nothing else, we should be able to account for, what was attempted. If you're take yourself out of crypto for a minute and put yourself into a store, right? If you walk in somewhere and you're trying to buy something, and you put your chip card down, and nothing happens, you and the merchant both understand something's not right there. You don't get to walk away with the merchandise, but they're also not throwing you in jail either for trying to steal from them. They understand that there's a technology that's messed up in the middle. So you get an opportunity to correct it. You can either go to cash, you can retry, you can try a different card. You know what I mean? There's this moment in time where dealing with it is okay. But there's not in the crypto world. There's no notion of that, right? That moment between the merchant and the customer doesn't exist at all.
Well, yeah, not to mention this paradox of whoever believes that code is law. If you're very good at exploiting the code, is this considered a crime at this point, right? Like, what I'm saying.
I think after FTX, they're going to consider it a crime.
Well, no, but FTX is a group of individuals acting maliciously with probably malicious intent or very incompetently. But I'm saying, imagine a situation that we live in a world of DeFi only, right? Everything is happening on chain only, and if there is a bridge exploit because somebody, I don't know, got majority of the validator nodes through staking, right? Is this a crime or not? Because the protocol worked exactly as designed, right? It's just the outcome was different than intended.
Yeah, but I mean, that we're gonna go down a rat hole, but we'll go there for a second, right? But that makes no difference, right? A crime is a crime, regardless of how it's committed, right? If the posted speed limit is 55 and you go 56, technically that's a crime. You may not get prosecuted for it, right? But it doesn't matter why you're going 56. You could be on your way to the hospital. You could be, your meter could be off on your car. It doesn't matter. The fact is you crossed the line, and therefore the line is what defines the law. What's really interesting in the bridging case is, with quote code as law, there's no notion of an external law at all. It's like you said, what's in the contract, the program, we call them contracts because it makes them sound cooler, but what's in the functional program that we call a contract, right, is what happens. There's no notion of should. Like, we keep saying it, right? Should this happen? Should that happen? There isn't a notion of that, right? and there's no way to enforce something that from outside anyway. Like, I mean, in order to gain security over someone stealing your contract or stealing your code and making it do something that you don't want to have happen, all of the existing ecosystem has created a notion of only the owner can do X and Y, and the owner can allow someone else to execute the code, but not necessarily to audit or see it or change it, right? But none of those are laws. None
Yeah,
of them are laws, right?
exactly.
It's just convention. And it's the same thing. You've got this malleable governance out there, that meaning that the rules of the game can be changed based on some form of consensus at any given time. And because of that, there's no way to have a speed limit, right? If the speed limit can be constantly changed, and the only people
Yeah,
that
by
are in
the
charge
drivers,
of,
by the
right,
drivers, right?
and the only time that you ever can tell whether or not the speed limit was exceeded is after the fact, right?
Mhm.
And you're allowed to change what after the fact actually is. There can't be law. Is that bad? That's a different question. But I do think, and I'm pretty sure that there's a large contingent out there that would find that unacceptable, especially for monetary transactions, transactions involving human life or safety, things that matter to
Yeah,
folks
I
at the
mean,
core. That's going to be
we
difficult.
don't even have to go to the extreme, right? In business, a notion of recourse is very important. Right?
Yeah,
If something goes wrong, you get your money back. That, in essence, and on blockchain, it doesn't exist, right? It's the same with bridging. Yeah, it's like you send your tokens to the wormhole bridge,
yeah,
then yeah.
and hope. All right, so let me ask you a question. So if as an economist, what should be there or not? Is it really the market drives and what happens, or should there be something to sway the outcome, or at least, do you see what I mean? Like, is there, I know there's this notion of like pure capitalism, but that even is, there's
No,
whatever.
that it's
Do you see what I mean?
fantasy. It's fantasy because think about it. Even the market is not in vacuum. Any market is just a construct of law, and law is construct of arbitrary decisions made by people. However, this governance process worked because back in the day it was the guy with the longest sword who said, I kill anybody who opposes, right? And that was the governance process. And now we evolved a little bit, and basically in the US you have lobbyists that you have to pay hefty to get what you want, right? So there is no notion of some sort of arbitrary, let's say, let's say, idealistic free market institution. Because think about it. Even if you think about the notion of market as simple as two actors come and they can negotiate price and exchange goods, all of this implies that one actor doesn't just kill the other actor, right? And takes all of it. If you have a notion of exchange, you have a notion of law. And law is the creation of state. However, the state you're going to define, a city state, a nation state, even a tribe, right? But there has to be some sort of governance structure. And then inside this governance structure, there are different institutions. One of those institutions are markets. Yeah.
Okay.
So, and this is, and money is also another institution that is arbitrarily created by the state, right? So
Right.
even the notion of value is only relevant if you have some sort of enforcement mechanism that can only be guaranteed by a legal system. Yeah. And let's say I get a lot of heat from Bitcoin maxis because my very unpopular claim is that the paradox of Bitcoin is that the value of Bitcoin is 100% dependent on the ability to exchange Bitcoin to fiat.
Yeah. If all of a sudden Bitcoin turned off, Bitcoin is no longer worth something.
It's not even Bitcoin turning off. You can have the Bitcoin network operating as it operates, but if you switch off all the centralized exchanges and you make it illegal for people to buy and sell Bitcoin, right? It's not about anything at this point, right? And if anybody was to argue with this, ask yourself a question: why we still quote the price of Bitcoin in dollars? To answer your question very briefly, there is no free market and there is no notion of value outside of the rule of law in general.
Okay, so then what do we do to make it so that, you know, right now the Web3 world is a series of islands. You know, there's marketplaces. I think there's this notion on sort of the outside world, at least the non-technical world, that Web3 is an ecosystem or a marketplace, but that is not actually the case any more than when you know, when eBay started, they called it the world yard sale, right? But that wasn't true either, right? It was, we happened to have a lot of goods for sale that looked like they'd be in yard sales, but we were our own marketplace. But you couldn't buy something from us and then go to Amazon, or take that thing from Amazon and then go to Walmart, right? Those are different marketplaces, right? Some are brick and mortar, some are two different types of, two different types of online, some are, sort of human to human. Arno, who's on here, but, quiet, came from one that was based on barter. It did not last long. But my point though is right now in Web3 world, it's lots of technically speaking, you have unassociated, difficult to move between, or as we would say, we would call it high friction, extremely high friction markets, right? It's not easy to move between things. If anybody wants to try it, just go up there and say, I want to move Ethereum to Binance Smart Chain, and watch how many steps you have to take manually in order to make that happen, right? It's not an easy process. It's easier to actually get in your car, go to the airport, and try and exchange dollars for euros and then drive back home than it is to change a token over. So what do we do? Like, how do we make this better?
Well, yeah, you reduce the friction. This is the key word. You reduce the friction.
So I'm going to take it and I'm going to build code that allows anybody to do anything as fast as possible with no guardrails.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, look, if you want to nerd out a little bit about economics, you have this branch of economics that's called the theory of the firm. And the question is like, why do even firms or enterprises exist, right? If anybody would be in a free market reality and everybody would interact with anybody else freely, then what are the incentives to basically give away part of your value to some larger organization than yourself, right? Well, and the answer to this is that when you interact with people, there are transaction costs that are associated with transactions. So in order to conduct the transaction, sell your 5 ounce of silver, you have to go to some other trouble, like drive someplace or list it, right? And it all costs money, and there are risks, because how are you going to actually do the transaction? Are you going to take cash from somebody? Do you want them to come to your house? Do you want to go to their house? Do you know that this cash is not, let's say, marked by DEA or stuff like that, right? So those are all transaction costs. And the higher the transaction costs, the higher the incentives are to keep the economic activity within the firm or the enterprise. And what we are seeing in Web3 right now is that the transaction costs between different chains or even between different ecosystems are extremely high. And those are not transactions, let's say, where you paid out of the pocket, but also the risk is incredibly high. right? It's also a financial cost that is, let's say, binary, right? So either it costs you zero, but when the risk is realized, then it costs you a lot of money at one time. So you have those Web3 ecosystems that become those enterprises that just operate in isolation, as you said. You have a lot of violence, and in order to facilitate the interactions between those islands, you need to work on lowering those transaction costs or interaction costs. So lower risk, fewer manual processes, better data, better analytics, better understanding of different market conditions in those different islands. This is what you need to do. And recourse, right? And also think about this. If you are trading with a country, if I'm in Portugal right now, if you want to do business with any other country in the EU, the transaction costs are relatively comparable to doing business internally because of the harmonization of the legal system, of all the laws, regulations, and about the recourse that you have. But if you want to, from Portugal, transact with Iran or with North Korea, those transaction costs are extremely high, right? Because the legal system is completely incompatible, right? And the legal system in Portugal actually imposes huge transaction costs on purpose, right? To dissuade people from doing this. Yeah. So again, even the fact that you can harmonize rules or, as you said, map the data structures inside different islands, I mean, that's a good step forward.
Yeah. So I want to call out, a technical side of that a little bit, at least draw people's focus to it, based on what you just said, and tie back into the trilemma here at the same time. First, you pointed out that that Portugal imposes arbitrary or additional transaction costs to be able to conduct business with certain places, called out Iran in that case, right? That's a case where the law is actually imposing some sort of other judgment, has nothing to do with the transaction itself, at least not at an economic level. It has to do with a political decision that's been made there, but is enforcing an economic change, right?
Yeah, you can say, but based on the metadata of the transaction,
right? And so one thing that I want to call out there is from a software perspective, if you were to write that, you would say something to the effect of, if client or if party one is Portuguese and party two is Iranian, then increase the transaction cost by 50% or something like that, multiply by whatever this, and then change that. That would be what's happening. And that would be what code as law looks like, right? It'd be like, if this and that, then do this. The notion of should, ought, anything like that doesn't come into play, right? But nevertheless, the software is biased, right? It's obviously biased because it made a decision there that had nothing to do with the transaction. It brought in outside will and imposed it, right? If this and that, then that, right? We did the same thing a lot. If you on again, I'll use eBay as an example. It's perfectly legal to list items from Nazi Germany on eBay, but it's absolutely illegal to purchase them if you are a French citizen or you're conducting business in France, right? So we have arbitrary rules on the market that say, list this all you want. If you're French, you can't buy it or see it, right? You could go to Liechtenstein and see it perfectly well and purchase it, right? But and so the notion that a market is purely a function of the goods being exchanged, even in software, is fictional, right? And that's true of what's out there already in the Web3 space. Software is always biased. You're writing it just like a book, and it's biased by who's writing it, how they're writing it, the rules that they have to go by, the things they're trying to accomplish. And there isn't this notion that code as law functions outside of the will and desires of the folks that are writing it. That's kind of the point I want to make here. I'm going to leave it. The second thing, though, that you were talking about is you have a situation where you've chosen to impose aspects of the exchange, you've chosen because of security or because of political will or something to make something more difficult, to decrease scalability in that case. If you make something more expensive, the number of people that can conduct it is limited, right? Because scarcity comes into play. Okay, if we look at that on the blockchain trilemma, now what you just said was we're going to intentionally make a decision that doesn't have anything to do with decentralization, doesn't have anything purely to do with security, but we're going to impact scalability anyway. And you've dragged the needle away from that corner, right? Towards some other place. And this is why I want people to think of it more as a continuum in the middle, because there's a lot more to what's happening in the exchange than those three things, which can impact those three corners. They're not really corners, but we'll call them that. And it's also the thing that makes the entire notion, fictional, because you can put any three dimensions you want that can impact there's lots and lots of things that can impact any particular transaction on any particular marketplace, because they're defined by who's in charge of the marketplace, right? And so you can make a trilemma out of anything, or a parallelogram, or any other kind of diagram you want with all these different points on it. What's not true is that there's nothing that eliminates the three other than choice, right? It's up to the humans that are implementing the software to decide to abandon one or the other. So if we decide to centralize something, it has nothing to do with whether or not decentralization is difficult. It has to do because we made a decision one way or the other. It may actually be difficult, but I want everybody who's listening to understand that when you implement software, you are writing the book that is the software. It's the people that are writing it. It doesn't have to do wholly with the environment in which the software operates. Sometimes it does. And I don't want to make it sound like, in a idealistic world, Bitcoin would be able to process 100 million transactions per second, because it can't. The way it's designed, there are physical constraints that come into play there. But we make a bigger deal about the physical constraints when in fact we're mostly talking about, or at least a lot of the time we're talking about, constraints that have to do with software bias, political will, things we think ought to be good. For example, I've looked at 4 or 5 different versions of the blockchain trilemma as I've been sitting here, different people drawing the picture. In all but one of them, decentralization sits at the top. Like it's some sort of ideal we all struggle for, right? And I'm the first one to come and tell you there's nothing in the world that desires decentralization, right? Not in there's no naturally occurring decentralization other than, I suppose, weather. Right? Which is also not decentralized, right? It happens in local areas. So this notion that we're trying for some greater good, or because that's the way it ought to be, or something like that, to spread decision making as wide as possible, that's not the only way that good decisions can be made.
Oh, that's true. And there's also a question: what does decentralization mean, right?
Yeah.
This is a whole different podcast series.
And it's a different podcast. That I just want to point out that the triangle, right, has at least one thing on there that is wholly, completely biased. The fact that it even gets a spot as a corner is itself a bias, right? Security and scalability are the same way, but they're generally accepted. This decentralized thing has popped into the Web3 world as sort of a synonym for Web3.
Yeah,
and I want us to be like,
but I also understand the power of this diagram, because for let's say non-technical people, for example, like myself, this might be a very useful meme to wrap your head around certain things, right? But now, I mean, when I talk to you, it almost seems like somebody who came up with this probably was in charge of designing Ethereum, right? And somebody told them, hey, why is it so slow? And why is it so expensive to run? And they said, oh, here is a diagram that explains this, right? And now go away. it's impossible, right? What you want is impossible. Where in fact, okay, it's impossible if you make this particular architecture choices, right?
Yes.
But if you look at the problem from a different perspective and you don't have any presuppositions how we're going to solve this problem, maybe there are solutions, as you said. Maybe you can look at stuff that has been done before and similar problems that have been solved, right?
Yeah. When we talk about walking across a bridge or exchanging, silver, those kinds of things, people have been doing this for a lot longer than there's been Web3 around, right? Um, and so, Trilix, we stand on the shoulders of the giants before us. And when approached, in fact, it was you, Michael, that first approached the how is it that we, can we bridge? That was your first question. And I was like, of course we can bridge. That's just moving something from one place to another. But you wanted me to think more about it. And in thinking of it, the first thing that came to me was there's a very weird situation that's happening here, right? Bridging is by definition a place where you need as much trust as possible because you're moving value from one entity to another, and the framework for the value is changing at the same time. We won't talk Web3. Let's just talk, buying a house, right? I used to live here. I'm trying to sell my house. You're trying to buy my house. I don't know you, but I would really like your money. You don't know me, but you want a house that's not going to collapse the day you move into it, right? So what do we do, right? How do we do that? Well, we bring in third parties that are not interested in the asset. They're interested in being a reliable place to put your thoughts and trust to validate the asset. You bring in people to, property inspectors who will go and say, yep, this thing is not going to fall down. And if it does, my signature on this piece of paper means you can come sue me because I missed something, right? You bring in a title company whose job it is to make sure that that guy actually owns the house and they didn't just squat in it for the last month and then try and sell it to you, right? They go and investigate the history of the property and find out, you bring in lots of these different experts who are not, again, interested in the asset, but they're interested in the safety and security of the exchange itself, the transaction that's happening, to help make that a safer thing so that the trust gets added. In fact, you actually move the money with a third party, right? You create this notion of escrow where, my money goes into the escrow account, you fulfill your side of the bargain, and then it becomes your money and I get the keys, right? In the same moment by a third party. It's not, you don't hand me the keys. It's the title company or the escrow company that hands me the keys. So, when I was thinking about the bridging, the first thing I said was, wait a minute, where's the escrow company here? Because all bridges are essentially built the same way. On my side, or we'll keep the model. If I'm getting your house, you've got a house on chain one, right? You essentially lock that house so that the best thing you can say is, I can't sell it anymore during the bounds of this transaction. No one else can take it away from me. I'm not going to give it anywhere else. You lock it up. And over here, I take some assets and I say, okay, I'm going to lock my assets up over here. And then we agree on some means that, this number of mine equals that many of yours, right? And we agree on that, and with communications, secured or not. There's ways to try and make that. And then in some moment of time, not clock time, because blocks don't work that way. Blocks work by vector time, by which is the next block. I release mine to you and you release yours to me on the other entity. Again, it's actually creating a new thing on either side, and they move with nothing in the middle to ensure that that was done properly, safely, the correct way, or anything like that, right? So I said, well, wait, why couldn't we just having escrow, right? Just escrow alone, some entity that had a representative on both sides of the fence, that you could, that person, uninterested could be the thing that did stuff. That alone would be more interesting, or at least safer, right? And I'm not trying to make it sound like escrow is the best solution in the entire world for doing exchange. I'm just pointing out that it's a well understood paradigm with hundreds of years of backing, right? We know it works. It may not be perfect. There's ways to mess with it, but just because it's old doesn't mean it's not considered a best practice. And so my question was, why not do that? So, one of the things that we did technically on the Trilix side is we thought through escrow. How would we implement a bridge? And that was my answer back to Michael, after going through all this, is like, I would implement escrow. Right. That's how I would do it. And then you came back and said, well, that's not very decentralized. And I said, why do I want somebody I've never met in Zambia having a part of this? That to me is even worse. Right? I just want it to happen the way I want it to happen. So yeah, I fully admit that the notion of a custodial holder of value in the middle of this, which is effectively what escrow would be, doesn't entertain decentralization. But my response to that would be, why on earth do I want to entertain decentralization when my only goal in life is to make this one transaction between two known entities happen?
The argument for decentralization of bridges. I mean, yeah, we had a lot of discussion about this. The, let's say, main advantage is not to have democracy and people voting who was right and was wrong. The way I see it is the main argument for decentralization is the availability of the service. And the way I see it is this. Yes, there is a finite and well understood numbers or number of validators on Polygon or Polkadot, but it's more than one or two, right? So if there is a meteor strike and one of the validators goes out of business, you have this 99 who's still going to propagate the blockchain. And this is what I would expect as a user of a blockchain from a bridge. So if I'm comfortable trusting the Polkadot validators or Polygon validators that they're actually going to maintain the chain that says how much assets do I have, I wouldn't expect anything less in terms of availability and reliability from a bridging service. Yeah. So this is the argument, right? So I don't want a situation where, okay, I have a very secure bridge for as long as this one party is actually interested in doing it or capable, because maybe the meteor strike and now all those smart contracts are locked out. So I want to have a situation where I really like what you said. You have disinterested party and maybe disinterested as in the validators physically cannot touch the assets that are transferring, right? Then they are very disinterested because they only get paid if they do their job right.
Right.
And there's no incentive of changing governance or creating a rule or a consensus that now Michael's tokens are our tokens. So I like this notion. What I would like to have is a system where we have the escrow that is operated by some parties that specialize in that and are disinterested, but also there's just more than one entity, right? Just for the sake of me being, let's say, comfortable that there has to be more than one catastrophe at the same time for this bridge to go out, right?
Yes. And I would say to that, I understand. And so it sounds like the main interest would be ensuring the longevity of the behavior.
Correct.
During it, not just during the actual event, but ensuring that can happen, long after the effect. I will also point out that no one uses dinars anymore. And that there are currencies that die out over time, even ones that had lasted for hundreds of years. And so there's no such thing as forever, although that's also another podcast though, because we gotta talk through what forever means, right? But what I would say is that decentralization does do a good job of ensuring the viability of a platform.
Mm-hmm.
And again, as long as a platform is available and there is a mechanism that you, the individual, can leverage to utilize it. because that, there's two things there, right? Then that does help. However, decentralization is not the only way to make things have longevity, right? There's other approaches to that. But second of all, well, probably out of order. The most important thing I'll point out though is in the case of a bridge, your longevity is fractured in at least the number of endpoints of the bridge, right? So, if you've got two pylons, whichever is the weakest pylon is going to inevitably in a decentralized state become the availability you get. So if you're going from, I don't want to call anybody out because it'll sound mean. So chain C over to Polygon, right? And Polygon has an availability score of 1 and chain C has an availability score of 0.2, right? No matter how great it's going to be, 0.2 is the best that you're going to be able to get. And there is no incentive whatsoever for Polygon to improve the availability of chain C, right? They would rather you move everything over and leave it there. And so again, it calls back to this notion that we started with, is like, it takes a disinterested third party to become interested in the safety and behavior itself in order to improve any of that. And do we have all the answers yet? No, right? I don't want to act like we do, because we're new and we're still thinking through it. But at least we're thinking through it, right? And we are interested in the behavior, especially as the behavior goes between the islands. And so we're working on it. There's definite ways that you can improve it. There's things that can be done strictly on the behavior itself, like just having a record that the money was there at some point, right, is a benefit. Right now, again, back to FTX, right? There's what, $16 billion? We don't know where it is, just gone.
Yeah.
At least they could have written down that it's, my $1,000 came at this point over here, and I've got proof that it was at some point over there, right? That alone, it would be useful, even in that case. So yeah, we got to start at the bottom, and we'll figure some of this out. But at least somebody's thinking about it, right? It's time everybody thought about it, but we're gonna try and lead the charge, I guess.
No, yeah. But I mean, we have some ideas, right? How to solve
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, and I think generally speaking that we call it the third 3-pylon bridge. You got the the center support or whatever, and we're trying to create that structure. I used escrow as an example, but there's lots of other types of things, notaries and things like that, where we use third parties to reduce the friction or increase the safety, however you want to, there's different things you can do within transactions. And yeah, we are thinking through a lot of those cases, and we have some ideas. Notary, for example, is very easy to implement. All you have to do is write down on another place what happened in between these two places, right? So that you're no longer dependent on that. And the more times you write
Polygon and chain C, you can also write to Ethereum.
Yeah, you write on Ethereum or write it on Solana or write on both, like, yeah, there's lots and lots of copies of the Constitution, right? If we lose the first one, it's okay. We got lots of them, right? That kind of thing helps, right? And it sounds boring, but you know what? Lots of copies, it works well. If you lose one, got more. That's a good thing. And so, a proper notary service would do exactly that, right? The fact that I tried to walk across the bridge and didn't succeed. I tried and I did succeed. I tried, and even better, I tried with this amount of value over here, which was worth this at the time, over to that, and this is what it happened to be. And then you link it to a third set of value that was available at the time, so that no one can come back and change the history on either side and go, oh, well, it turns out, you thought it was 1,000, it was worth 1,000 of something, it was really worth 2 of something. Well, no, according to this at the time, it was worth this, and you're not in charge of governing the value there. I know that gets all boring, but there are lots of things that you can do and should do that are actually pretty easy. As long as you come to Web3 and see it as a collection of ecosystems that are looking to work together, as opposed to ecosystems that are looking to supplant each other, right?
Mhm.
And I don't want to make it sound like, Polygon's out to supplant Bitcoin or something like that. I actually no longer think that that's the case for most entities, but I will say that until there's a way to incentivize a platform, an island provider to make other islands better, it will always be the lowest priority, right? Altruism is great, but it's not well incented. You see, you know what I mean? Especially if you're in a profit making business. And right now, I can't think of any Web3 platform providers who are not for profit entities, right? So it's
Mhm.
going to take someone who's trying to derive value or profit from a different concept in order to be able to incentivize that. And again, this is where Trilix walks to the table. We're not trying to be a layer zero or a layer one provider of value. We are perfectly content to derive our value off of making the entire ecosystem better, right? Making the islands have bridges to each other, making the roads on an island better, giving people helicopters. I mean, all of these kinds of things are useful to us, and we still value the off-chain world, which is another thing that we haven't really talked about in this particular case. But what if you wanted to bridge Swift transactions over to Binance? Right
Mhm.
now, you can only do that through for-profit exchanges, and they're in charge of setting the value. Um, but it doesn't mean they have to be. It's just that's the way it currently is.
Yeah,
And
or any fiat-backed stablecoin, right?
yeah,
Uh, it
fiat
would
back
be, yeah, because in my ideal world, everybody who has a bank account will be able to mint their own stablecoin on chain, and everybody who has it then can redeem it for the underlying asset. I mean, this is really decentralized. And what we have right now is one company that does half a decent job auditing themselves, and we all have to trust them, right? That the dollars are there, and probably the dollars are there, but again, it's like who knows? We haven't been to their vault and counted the bills, right? So
well, so let me ask that then. um Most of us have not been to the vaults at all the banks. I've never even been to the vault at my local bank, right?
mhm,
um Heck, some local banks don't even have vaults anymore.
mhm.
You know what I mean? um why is it that we trust them? Why do we
Well,
trust that the bank has the money they claim to have?
because of the legal structure in the country, because you have, I mean, the Federal Reserve is to ultimately guarantee that everybody gets their money.
Or some
And
part of their money anyway.
well, you have the deposit insurance, right? So I mean, because think about it, banks are really government agencies that have been privatized for unknown reason to me, really, because they have the monopoly to create money, like the public legal tender, right? Well, I mean, the Federal Reserve was a very good idea, right? Because why it was even created? Because this prevents bank runs, right? Because any bank that is let's say chartered bank and is licensed has the ability to borrow any amount of reserves from the Federal Reserve if people come to the cash register and they ask for their cash. Yeah? So the banks can take all those assets, all those loans, and use it as collateral and borrow against it to make everybody whole. And because you know that you're always going to get your money back, you don't ask for it. This is the paradox. Right?
Right. No, I think that's good. And again, I mean, we won't talk FTX today, but in
Well, yeah,
that
the
particular
problem with crypto exchanges is that there is no Federal Reserve for crypto
right, there's no
exchanges, right?
well, but and it's done in the name of lack of friction. I don't know. It's probably a different podcast, but I'll log some of it now in case we need it for later, right? They do a lot of this stuff because they claim that there's too much friction in the existing banking system. And I'll be the first to admit, having spent 20 years working on lowering that friction, right? There is a lot of friction in that,
Right.
but there's safety in that too, and safety increases the value. In fact, I would argue that when it comes down to it, safety is worth more to the average transaction. Maybe not to the consumer, maybe not to the merchant, but to the average transaction, safety is more
Well,
valuable than the lack of friction,
well,
which is why Bitcoin is successful. It takes forever to move Bitcoin around.
well, look, the way I see it is that there's a trade-off between convenience and security for transactions. And the higher the value of the transaction is, you're going to lean towards security, and you're going to say, oh, I don't mind the friction, right? And the lower the transaction value is,
Okay.
and think about cash. This is exactly what's happening, right? For low value transactions, the convenience of cash used to be because cash is very inconvenient. If you lose it, you lose it. Right? It's like Bitcoin. There is no recourse, right? And the paradox is, cash is single side accounting, right? You just have the better instrument, exactly like Bitcoin. Yeah, it cannot be in two places at a time. And if somebody steals it from you, and like with Bitcoin, if they're going to hit you with a pipe over the head until you give them your private key,
Yeah.
it's gone, right?
Right.
Same with cash. If somebody's gonna, hold you at the gunpoint and say, give me a wallet, then the cash is gone. This is the same way, right? It's way more difficult to steal something from a bank that is, let's say, inside the bank account, right? From you. So this is how I see it. The low value transactions tend to prefer convenience and speed, and high value transactions tend to prefer security and recourse and some sort of insurance and this kind of stuff.
So again, then there can be a continuum between that. There doesn't need to
Yeah,
be
there
one.
is a continuum, and look, I even see that this sort of dynamics can play in different consensus mechanism when we talk about bridges. Let's say,
Yeah.
just for the sake of argument, let's imagine that we have 100 validators, and you decide how many validators need to approve this transaction before it gets posted, and you pay for each validation. So if you just want to transfer something that is worth $10, you can say, I want 2 out of 3 consensus, right? But if I'm transferring, I don't know, 500 million, then I want all of them, and I want no objection votes, and I want this to be done triple, and I want this posted to 7 different public chains, and I want to see it before I move with this transaction. Let's talk about, I mean, what we discussed, at least from this, let's say, high level overview, how this bridge would work. So we talked about the fact that there is some sort of a notary service, there is some sort of an escrow service, and you have, let's say, professional parties that run those processes. And what I really like with Trilix and with your design, let's say, principle, is that the governance is sealed. It's completely immalleable, right? It's firm, and the governance doesn't change. And maybe you
Yeah.
can expand on that a little bit, because
Well,
that's a novel concept for blockchain.
it's the speed limit thing, right? You post a speed limit, it's 55 miles an hour here. People will hate it or not, but it's still 55. It takes a lot of effort to go and change it. And the only way it gets changed, even if they make a new law, it doesn't actually change until somebody goes out there, digs up that sign and puts a new sign in place, and then it's a new speed limit, right? And that's how we look at governance. We are not against the notion of voting or adjusting behavior based on conditions, right? And they could be all kinds of different conditions. We're not against that. What we disagree with is that what constitutes a valid behavior today, that same behavior can be constituted with different conditions tomorrow, and there's no way to know what was different at the time, right?
Mhm.
If the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit gets changed, there's a record of that. There's a law that got adopted. There's all that's been certified. There's a record of the guy going out, digging up the sign, putting a new sign in. It's very easy to tell exactly when that happened. And there is no time where somebody got written a ticket for going 56 when the law had actually moved it to 70 or whatever, right?
Mhm.
That doesn't happen. There's no enforcement of the new rule until all of the parameters to show you what the rule is are in place. That's how Trilix is designed to be as well, right? If you and I are going to exchange that house, right, we're going to have codified before we do the exchange what our rules about exchanging the house are going to be. We're going to have a property inspection. We're going to have an agreement on what the title looks like. We're going to have a 30-day waiting period to make sure that we really want, we're going to write down all these things that we're going to do before we start. And then we'll conduct the transaction, and it'll go through whatever steps are required to be able to
Mhm.
fulfill that set of rules that we put in place. And then a transaction will be complete, and I'll have a house and you've got some more money, right? If then we want to sell another house, we can either sell with the existing rules we had in place, or we can choose to have new rules, but we're going to codify those rules up before the behavior starts. And only after that those rules are in place, only after the 70-mile-an-hour sign is in the ground, do we start transacting. Now that sounds like a lot of friction in the creating transaction space, but we can automate all that. Again, remember, this stuff's software, right?
Mhm.
So it's not necessarily the easiest software, but the fact is we've had decision trees in software for a very long time. All we're saying is you codify what decisions you're going to make and how, and then you go and do stuff according to those rules. If you decide you want to change the rules, that's perfectly fine. You write down what you've changed them to, and then keep on transacting, right? And then in our world, we actually implement that in different places. So there's no point at which a behavior is different on the same chain. That's a physical thing that doesn't really matter as much for this particular conversation. But since think of it as like if we were talking about sidewalks, if you and I are walking down the same sidewalk and we decide that we want to walk down a brick sidewalk instead of a cement one, we'll construct a new first block of the brick one, and then we'll start walking on that. There won't ever be a time where there's a half cement, half brick type thing going on, so that you can't really tell. That way, anytime you look at a transaction, you will know exactly what the rules were in place at the time that transaction happened. There will be no question. There's no need to go back and understand, this version of the chain or anything like that. This, like, when we set things down, it's we prescribe the behavior, we behave. We can describe
Mhm.
a new behavior and then behave, but we can't
Right.
change in the middle. And
So,
that
so,
that's
so,
basically how we're designed.
so when we talk about bridging, you can basically, somebody who wants to launch a bridge, right, or operate a bridge, the first step would be to describe the bridging behavior specifically, right?
Mhm.
And then you can have a rule that this behavior cannot change, right?
Correct.
So basically, create a smart contract, throw away the private key, and then you post to 10 different public chains the behavior.
Yep. And we can
Uh,
even, for your longevity question, we can even post the actual software that we're using to implement it on all these other places. So
Yeah.
that if something goes away, you can retrieve that software, pull it back, and use it to transact again to do your rollback, for example.
Yeah. So, and then there's this one entity that says, I'm the first validator on this bridge, but if anybody else wants to validate based on those rules specifically, they can, right?
Yep, here you go. Here's your access. Go pull from this block and then start run the transaction you find there, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And then it's impossible for the validator to do anything else than specifically codified in
Yeah.
this. And but by the way, I think the banking laws should also work like this, because this is
Me too.
digression,
Yes. Yeah.
because the banking law should be, here is a list of things you are allowed to do as a bank. You're not allowed to do anything else. And how the banking law works now is the opposite. Here is the list of forbidden stuff. And go figure loopholes.
Yeah,
Now, right?
do whatever you want until we decide you've tripped over and falling into one of these things. Yeah,
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. So I think this is interesting, right? Because now you can have a situation where you can have a set of rules where there are more than one parties who guarantee the availability of the service, and then they get paid some sort of a transaction fee. And part of the rules is that it's physically impossible for them to access to those funds that are inside those smart contracts, right, on inside of the project. And then you can have some sort of a, let's say, penalty or slashing mechanism where all those parties have to stake some economic value. And then when one of those parties or any of those parties that misbehaves gets slashed and immediately kicked out of the game. Right?
right. Without you actually writing down the result. That's the other thing that's different than us, right? There's, we won't codify invalid behavior with a
Yes.
value driven consensus mechanism, regardless of what it is. Doesn't matter, proof of anything, right? Which relies on your version of history in some aspect of that. I mean, they all do, right? There is this notion that the winner determines what happens, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying.
And
And over here, what we're saying is there is a constitution that defines what is true, what is not true.
yep,
And we're only going to check with the constitution. We're not going to let you vote as a democracy
correct.
whether
Yeah.
what's right and what's wrong.
Yeah, there's no way to codify something that didn't follow the behavior. It can't be written down. The most that can happen is this is incorrect. And as you said, you can, things that will, faults happen that can cause incorrect answers.
Mhm.
But everyone else will just say no. And if you get too many of these, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrongs, then you get penalized, kicked out, or whatever, right? And again, that is in place from the beginning. This is not something that we strive towards. And that's, another thing we see in the Web3 world, that there's a notion of slashing, and then there's actually implemented slashing. There's there's a lot of people aiming for slashing, and the number of people actually slashing is low. And the reason is because it's very difficult, because you basically have to have what we would in philosophy we would say is a self-evident rule for why you should be slashed. And they don't want to do that because it goes against, they're trying to go with, again, malleable governance assumes that at any given moment, what is self-evident is changing, right? We call that, again, philosophy, that's relativism, right? It changes over time. But the trouble is, to determine something was relativistic in the first place, you must have a self-evident statement somewhere. We're just not trying to hide it. We say, look, rather than try and figure that out and try and figure out what the self-evident thing or what the final rule, the line you cannot cross ought to be, we're just going to say from the beginning, these are the rules, you cannot cross them, period. The answer is the number of times you may cross it is 0, right? It doesn't ever change. So
and that's interesting, right? Because you have an ecosystem that is, let's say, participation is voluntary, and everybody understands the rule of the game before they participate, right?
correct. Yep. And we make the rules. The rules are publicly available. Anybody can look at what the rule is, and they vary by definition, but all behaviors are codified, and all of those rules are observable.
Which is very interesting, right? Because then let's imagine there's a meteor strike and it happened to hit all the data centers of the validators. You can even imagine a scenario that somebody can look at all those rules and recreate a validator that's going to keep playing the same game, even if anybody else is dead, right? So
right. And it's actually not difficult to create that validator. That's the other thing that the validation schemes that we have today are all bound up in lots of algorithmic science going alongside the action of recording transactions. In our world, it's very simple. Record the transaction. If X is X plus 2, then guess what you have to implement in order to create a validator? F is X plus 2, right? You don't have to have all this other stuff. Now you may want to go with an agreement scheme or something like that, but you don't have to. Again, your gradation, right? If I'm just going out there and playing, basketball, and I want to have an automatic scoreboard in a neighborhood, right? It's good enough that I'm, somebody can hit a button and start the game over. Doesn't, you know what I mean? That's okay. If I'm in the Olympics for basketball, then I want a lot more people paying attention to win the, you know what I mean? But I want to be able to be able to do that. And in those cases, the rules of basketball haven't changed, right? What you care about is observing that those rules are being observed properly, right? And so you put more checks and balances around that. And for us, again, because this is the way we work, the definition of how you check and behave is actually another behavior for us, right? So if the behavior is X plus 2, and what we want to do is say something like 4 people have to agree on what X plus 2 was. Sorry, 5 people have to agree on what X plus 2 was, right? Then that's another behavior, right? In fact, we could even do 4, we just make it unanimous, right? You have to have all 4 agree or we don't make progress. That, these are, they seem simple and we laugh. We're kind of laughing at each other as we do this, but it's amazing that that some of these simple things haven't made it into some of the most popular, most popular places. And honestly, I think it's because of the pedigree, right? There's much more interest in the value that's being exchanged than the means by which it's actually being exchanged. But, me speaking as me and not necessarily as Trilix for a minute, I think that the growth of Web3 into all the markets it could go into, far beyond crypto, require us thinking through some of these other things, right? Because it's, honestly, moving cash, moving a currency around is actually not that hard. There's not that much to it, but there's much more advanced and difficult types of workload that can be done and can benefit from the technologies here. But we got to get this first one right before we can take on some of that harder stuff.
So, I mean, two things I wanted to point out. So one observation is that a specific one about the bridges, right? We can even separate behaviors into 2 types of behaviors. One is the behavior of actually doing the, let's say, doing the crossing. So somebody who's carrying the payload, right? And this can be a relatively narrow population of professionalized validators. And the second, the second behavior would be to check those validators, right? And
yeah,
and
I
if
would
you,
actually go one notch further. I would say that the idea of a custodian is not the same as a validator, right?
fine,
So yeah, the entity holding the value in the transfer is not the same as the entity that's checking to see if the transfer went successfully.
correct. And this is, let's say, solving the trilemma of decentralization versus performance, right? You can have a very decentralized consensus that checks the work of a relatively small population of professional workers that can optimize for speed, but the let's say check of their work is decentralized, so it's incredibly difficult to pollute and incredibly difficult to pinpoint specific party that's going to check you.
Yeah.
So
yeah. I mean, and all of the benefits that are well implemented and available today don't get tossed away by the way we think about things. You can opt into any of them, right? Or none of them, right? I mean, X plus 2 probably doesn't take the whole world to tell you that 2 or 3 agreement, in agreement is okay. But there's cases where you actually want to have a lot more, and there's nothing about our way of thinking that prohibits anywhere along the spectrum of decentralization and security on that arm. You can land anywhere you want based on what you're choosing to do at any given time.
yeah, and
Or
again,
even
right?
farther than what's available, right? I mean, I could sit there and say, I care so much about this particular transaction that I want it recorded on every available public blockchain in the world.
Exactly.
Right. Which, would be expensive from a truly, like an actual paying for it type of thing. But, for certain types of operations, it might be worth it.
Yeah. Yeah, especially when we're talking about transferring property on the blockchain, right?
Yeah. Like, I mean, United Nations resolutions, right? You want to have that recorded in anything that's going to be extant in the future. We were talking the other day and I was asking you about, paper as a technology. We don't usually think of paper as a technology, but it is.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to come up with what is required in order to give transactions that cross that bridge the type of longevity that paper has. That's actually a very difficult, well, or interesting problem, depending on how you think of it, right? But this is a definite way that you can do that, right? Rather than try and take on the burden of providing eternity as a storage mechanism, right? The fact that everyone knows about it is also a very good way of doing it without ever recording anything. The calendar, what day it is, everybody in the world agrees what the day is today. Somehow or other, everybody on the planet got in line with what day it is, right? There's people that argue that it's also this day or it translates into this other day, but at the end of the day, right? Keep saying day. You know what I mean? Like time itself, the calendar is become universal and ubiquitous for every person on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not written down anywhere. There's no official catalog of what day it is, right? We just all agree, and that's exactly what you're saying. Like if it's spread wide enough, we trust it. And that is a way that we can solve some of the longevity, or a potential way that we can look at longevity for the Web3 ecosystem, right? Write it down everywhere. Then if again, I don't want to call anybody out because it sounds bad, but if chain C for chain C, right? If chain C goes down, right, at least what was on chain C hasn't gone away. And that, but it takes thinking about it outside the chains in order to be able to do that.
So the second thought I had is a more of a, let's say, philosophical nature, because it seems like with Trilix you could implement any existing blockchain just as a very, very specific use case.
Yeah. And not only could we, that's actually how Trilix works, right? Every single use case gets its own persistence mechanism, which is a chain. We can use individual chains, we can instantiate new chains, we can use existing public chains, but the behavior, the records of the behavior are their own individual chain, however we choose to store that. We basically divorced the notion of data storage from the ledger concept in the first place. And that's actually, we were talking earlier about what, journaling and ledgering way back. That's one of the things that's always been difficult for the concept of using a journal. Right? The idea makes a lot of sense. Write it down before you write it down. It sounds weird. It's like pre-boarding the plane, right? But what you're basically saying is write down your intent, carry out your action, and then confirm that they match the double blind there, right? That you're going to do this. You did something, you did that, and then you can move forward, right? The trouble was that all the
commit
journals,
and reveal, basically.
yeah.
Right? Yeah.
The trouble is that the ledgers are always bound up in a particular technology, right? So you're basically using the technology you're trying to guard against the technology you're trying to guard against. Again, that's the whole self-evident thing, right? So what we said was, look, how can we use this technology, generally speaking, this people are spending time creating digital ledgers that are trustable. Great. But how do I make it so that they're trustable for whatever I want to do, without being bound up in what it is that they're doing? And that's where the validator kind of thing comes in, right? Because they optimize a validator to do the types of transactions they expect you to be doing on the chain, which is why, some things are expensive, some things are hard, some things are impossible. You can't store arbitrary data on Bitcoin, because don't allow you to, you know what I mean? It's like the system doesn't allow that, right? So what we said was, well, wait a minute. What if we said we'll come up with a means by which we can store arbitrary data in our own way, in our own links together? Now it's just a factor of figuring out how to write something down on the other one. Even if we have to put it into a format that doesn't make a lot of sense for what we're trying to do, the fact that we can do so is itself valuable. So, if we're looking at a public chain, if Trilix is using a public chain, there's a gazillion blocks happening all the time. And I might transact with you here, and I might transact with you there and over here, and there might be 50,000 blocks in between. But what we do with Trilix is we link those internally to our system. We know that block 1 for our transaction is at block is over here on the public chain, and block 2 is at this other place, and so on. So we can construct our version of the behavior chain for us, even on a public chain that's doing other stuff at the same time. And of course, we can do it lots of other ways, including off chain. I can write it to a database. I can store it in a file. I could write it to a USB stick. It doesn't, once we've done that, all we're talking about is coming up with a safe way of proving that transactions happen one after the other, which we thank the blockchain world for giving us good ways of doing that from the storage engine itself. So we like the cryptography behind creating linked objects that can be proven. What we don't like is forcing that to be used in a particular mechanism to write it down. But as soon as we did that, it made us very almost infinitely flexible, so that we're future proof. And that's, when we talk about the future, one thing we can do is go back and write down our stuff in whatever is popular at the moment. We can go back in time and take that, audio cassette and write it to a CD, and then write it to a DVD, and then write it, you know what I mean? Like that's one of the things that Trilix can do. Sorry, I went off on that for another podcast, but we can use it.
No, that's great, because what you're saying is the data that you write to a public blockchain might not make any sense to anybody else if they don't have the context, right?
It won't. Yeah, I mean, for you, the only way to understand a Trilix chain is by starting at is to look at how it gets started, because that's where the governance is written down, and it tells you how the chain is added to, what the behavior is that we're codifying, the tasks involved in that behavior, the entities that are involved in those tasks, and what those actions actually look like, and what they mean in the real world, right? And where they came from, right? These are all written into the first chunk, right? And then from then out, we just store data. But how we write that out is completely arbitrary, right? We come up with our own mechanism by which we store things, which can be as persistent as writing to every chain in the world, or as transient as reading it in memory while it's on the wire and letting it go. We support the entire spectrum.
So to tie it to the bridge concept, you can also with Trilix, you can have some degree of privacy when it comes to bridging stuff, right?
Yeah, because we can create avatars or stand-ins or digital twins or whatever you want to think of them as for any aspect of any of the things I just mentioned, right? We can define a task X plus 2. We can define that even with an avatar, right? So that you don't know what's happening. We can obfuscate any and all aspects of what's happening, so that what's going on the bridge is incomprehensible, even if we make it publicly available to see it. Add to that we can also encrypt, we can encrypt data using keys from one spot and put the data that they're actually encrypting somewhere else, such that the keys are not available, even if you take it, we could write it to the USB stick. You can take the USB stick. There is no way of unencrypting it, because we don't even put, the public key there. We're just writing the data down. There's nothing, you have no idea, right? Now, is that perfect? No, I'm sure cryptography will change, and will change with it. But it is much different than the way at least most of the current blockchains work, where all of the keys are created using the logic of the chain itself, right? Which means if you own the chain and you have enough time, you can do whatever you want. We immediately approach the problem of saying, well, that's not best practice in the enterprise industry, right? best practice for security in the enterprise is to maintain keys completely isolated from where those keys are being used. No machine holds the keys, right? And so we use that same technology internally as part of what we do. As things get more advanced in the space, we will advance with it.
Excellent. So when you mention enterprises, it seems like from the enterprise point of view, you could have a completely composable app-specific blockchain using Trilix that leverages any or none of the public blockchains, or any of the of non-internal data storage, including private blockchains, right?
Correct. We could even go so far as to make a service like an Oracle output just the behavior you need to enact without the data itself. So we could say, again, that f of x, right? We could have it, you say, I'm calling the f of x, the function service from Ethereum, and it spits out the contract you want to run in Solidity. You call it from Solana, and it spits it out in Rust, right? Without any knowledge of what you're going to do. In fact, that's one question you had asked me in another conversation about how would you validate that what you're doing behind the scenes, assuming, let's say, you've got a private chain that's running all this stuff, or a permission chain. How could I use a public chain to validate what the permission chain is actually doing? And that's exactly how we would do it. Be like, here you go. Here's the logic. Take it. You can audit it and do whatever you want. This is the logic we're applying. Take some inputs. If you get this output at this range, then you know that by, here's the number of blocks. Here's the inputs you get. 27. We're on block number 27. Our answer is 27. We can prove, and you can test that as much as you want to prove that the logic of the permission system is resulting in the same logic that the alternate or public system would be doing. In fact, that's probably a service we will offer is, comparative logic, implementation or whatever.
Right. So what you're saying is, let's say there's an enterprise that wants to have a token bridge, and they can customize different, let's say, features. One being where the logic is stored, right? I can pick. Then you have another drop-down box. Where is your data stored? And you can pick and choose. And then who's actually operating the logic? Yep. And then you pick and choose, right? And you have full flexibility. It can be all you, or it can be all pushed out to the public chains. Correct. If you feel like it, right? Yep. And anything in the middle.
Yep. In fact, we already have that functional, right? So we have this notion of, we call it a service catalog. That's probably a little bit overloaded, but people at least know what that means. But whenever we create a behavior, which for us, and Arno, if you want to weigh in, come off mute. This is his stuff, right? Whenever we have a behavior which is made up of what we call actor entities, relationships between those actors, and tasks, whenever we create one of those, we make the behavior itself publicly available, as well as all of the components made to make it up, so that the application can be created by you without any impact or any part of what we're doing. So like, let's say we create the ability to increment and decrement an account somewhere, really simple, plus whatever. And we implement it on, a couple of chains or whatever. You can come along and say, I want to implement incrementing an in-memory structure in Redis for this thing, but I want to store the output on chain. That's something you've never come to us for. There's no use case for that. You don't have to. You can simply go to that service catalog and go, okay, I'm going to take the incrementing thing. I'm going to take the Redis engine, and I'm going to take the storage, the final result, and the storage engine. I'm going to make that be public Polygon, right? You can put those four together on your own, and the Trilix engine will run it for you, right? It once you codify the behavior, right? You say, okay, this is the behavior I want. Here it is. I'm going to start transacting. We will go create the structure internally, and then execute your code for you with no input from us at all.
Yeah.
Keeps our dev team small.
You'll basically be able to customize your own bridge, right?
Yeah, you'll be able to make your own bridge. You'll be able to make your on off chain thing. You can do your own mirroring, whatever, all of the base functionality that we come up with, will make it available. And then you can pick and choose, just like you said, that's exactly what it'll look like. There'll be a menu of different things you can use. You can query the API to get the current menu of what your options are and pick and choose. And then you say codify, and then it'll come in, we'll write it to the graph and come back and say, okay, you are transacting with this transaction type, and whatever that ID is, and use that transaction type when you send us data.
It's basically, we're going to give you a Lego box of 100 different Lego pieces, and you can build whatever you want from them.
Yeah. And the number of Legos will keep changing as we keep doing new stuff.
And if you need to build a bigger house with more windows, then you just buy more window pieces.
Right. Yeah, it'll be easier than doing all the different use cases, like one by one.
Let's say the way I see it, solving the blockchain trilemma with Trilix. You look at the problem from a different perspective. You look for, let's say, what was the use case, what do you want to do, and then you create a solution that is specific for solving this particular problem. So you don't necessarily have to have every single behavior or every single action possible crammed into a single chain that is single threaded or single path, if you will. Right? So we can have a solution where somebody who's the bridge operator can define their own behavior, can define their own rules of the game, and then define whether those rules are changeable or non-changeable. And then they also define the rules of, let's say, those operators or worker nodes or validators, how they work, what are the rules of the game over there. And then that's it, right? And then also you can pick stuff like, where does it post data to, where does it read from, this kind of stuff. And it seems like a fair degree of decentralization. And also it seems like you can implement this notion of an escrow account, this notion of notary. And also it seems like it solves scalability because you can have infinite number of those, let's say, app-specific solutions.
Right. Yeah, we divorce the idea of building the chain from storing stuff in the chain, or in a wider sense, mixing the cement to make the sidewalk is not the same as the sidewalk, right? And so that was our general approach to problem solving, is to say, okay, you need a sidewalk. Now let's figure out what your steps are made of and things like that, and then we can pick and choose the appropriate sidewalk and mechanism to build it to meet that need. And it doesn't answer everything yet that you were asking about, but it does give some interesting new ways of approaching the problems, and I think it will be something that grows far beyond what we even imagine, right? That's what we're going for, right? We're not trying to recreate Web3. We're trying to give Web3 the thought power and software capabilities to help it become something bigger than what it is right now.
So moving from islands to a network properly.
Yeah. And then when islands have become continents and nations, we'll be out there trying to figure out how to get the planets to work together. Right? That's where we always want to play in that place, because that's, for us, that's the thing that's interesting, is what could these components do? How do we build better Legos is a great analogy, right? How do we make the Lego pieces that people are going to want? But I would never be able to build the Lego Death Star on my own, right? But a designer who knows how to use the components really can. But I am very good at building the components, right, and designing how those work. And so that's the approach that Trilix is taking. Obviously, we'll have to demonstrate real world use case capability as we go, but we don't have the hubris to think that we'll be the only ones doing so. We just want to be a part of the party.
Excellent. So we don't want to be another layer 1. We don't want to be another layer 0. Maybe a layer -1.
Yeah, maybe a layer -1. You know, as we've been going through this, and I was thinking about the decentralization concept again. You know, I was like, well, what we would rather do is decentralize the decentralized platforms. You know, so like, pick your favorite 3. We would like you to be able to write to all 3 at once. So now you're 3 times as decentralized as you ever started, even if you went with immutable governance to get there, right? But you know, to what you were saying earlier, wouldn't it be great if you had all the availability of the top 3 as opposed to just one of the top 3, and then you had to hope that they were going to win the war? Why not just bet on everybody?
Definitely, absolutely. Well, excellent. So now I have to read off the script. Where can people find us?
You can find us at Trilix.io on the web, but no one uses the web anymore. So you follow our tweets, talk to us, and tell us where you want us to be, and we'll come find you.
Excellent. Thank you.